let them know that?
Oh yeah, so I can put it in the chat.
Timing
How about
from
that?
is
We're gonna hold for just a minute.
Yeah, we got 4 to 5. That's my wife, so I don't have trouble. I'd normally tell other people to sit down. Let's start off on the right foot. The wise man, clearly. Maybe I am going to have to sit her down. Attention, Karen Joint Maddox. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to see some of you in person. It's just great to have a sense of normalcy starting to emerge. We also have a large number of people online, and so for those who aren't joining us in person, we welcome you as well. And we're here in Ebnick. As you can see, they've kind of become COVID appropriate, so where they have really good hybrid services. So in total, we expect about 100 people seeing Bob's talk, which we're excited to see. For those of you who don't know, I'm Tom Maddox. I'm the Vice President of Digital Products and Innovation at BJC and a professor of cardiology in the division at WashU. We are thrilled to host Bob Wachter as one of our Innovation Lab speakers. This speaker series has been going since 2018. We had to put a pause on it for a pandemic, and we're excited to restart it. And it's appropriate that Bob is one of our first speakers, given his instrumental role in broadcasting a lot of really important COVID information, both nationally and internationally. So let me just give you a little bit of his bio, just to orient you to that. Bob is the professor and chair of the Department of Medicine at the University of California in San Francisco. He's a prolific author. He's authored 300 articles and 6 books. He also is credited with coining the term hospitalist and did that in 1996 and is often considered the father of the hospitalist field. He is a past president of the Society of Hospital Medicine and a past chair of the American Board of Internal Medicine. In 2015, Modern Healthcare magazine ranked him as the most influential physician executive in the United States. Not content to rest on those laurels, in the same year, he published a book called The Digital Doctor: Hope, Hype, and Harm at the Dawn of Medicine's Computer Age. It was a New York Times science bestseller. And then most recently, during the pandemic, 2020 to 2022, his tweets on COVID-19 were viewed more than 400 million times by his 260,000 followers. And he has served as a trusted source of information, which has been a critical role on the clinical public health and policy issues surrounding the pandemic. So today, we're excited to have Miri. He's going to speak twice on our campus, this afternoon for our Innovation Lab audience, and then tomorrow at our Department of Medicine's Grand Rounds. The talks will be slightly different, but today's talk is artificial intelligence in healthcare, separating the promise from the hype. And please join me in welcoming Bob to WashU.
Thank you, Tom. It's a joy to be here. Thank you for reading my mother's facts so accurately. It is a real joy to travel and see people and learn from others, and it's such a wonderful place. So I think we're all kind of getting used to this weird normal that we're in, but it feels very good to be doing that. I'm going to be speaking about AI today. The first 20 minutes or so will be what I see as foundational to understand where we are in the digital transformation of healthcare. Some of that I will repeat tomorrow. The rest of it will be different in both talks. This one's on AI. Tomorrow I'll continue on in medical grand rounds talking about broader issues in digital transformation. So if you want to come tomorrow, I hope you do. You find something else to do for the first 20 minutes, that'll work out fine. So let me go ahead and get started. And by the way, I'm hearing the father of the hospital is Field. Mark Williams is here, who was my older brother. Younger, sort of, I forget. But Mark was right next to me in the early days. And so I think you have done yourself very well recruiting Mark to help run your program. I look forward to hearing what you guys do together. So let me see if I can advance this. Let's see if this guy, I might need a little help on the advancing front. That's not working. Touchpad. All right. There we go. We'll do that. All right. Oh, it should start working. All right. The problem is this is a Windows computer, which is very foreign to me. Okay. So I'm going to talk briefly about what the electronic health record era, which I consider the last 10 or 15 years, has taught us about healthcare and digital transformation. The Cliff Notes is it's hard and much harder than it looks. What you really need to know about AI, and assuming you're not a programmer type, and I am not, some specific areas in which AI is likely to make a difference. And then I think probably the most interesting part of this is what are the speed bumps, anticipated consequences? And that sounds like an oxymoron, but to anticipate. I think that some of them actually we could think about what might happen and maybe prophylax against some of the problems, and then the bottom line. So as I said, the beginning will really be a review of what's happened in the last 10 or 15 years. And when it comes to digital transformation, this is what has happened. This is not a COVID surge. Every time you see a curve like that, it's, oh my God, is it surging again? No, this is the electronic health record adoption in American hospitals from 2008 to 2017. And see, in 2008, fewer than 1 in 10 hospitals in the United States had an electronic health record. And a decade later, fewer than 1 in 10 did not. So that's really a pretty extraordinary transformation. You're talking about a $4 trillion industry that went from paper-based industry to a digital-based industry in the space of 5 to 7 years. How did that happen? It happened because the federal government threw $30 billion at us to computerize. Everybody thinks that was in Obamacare because everybody thinks everything was in Obamacare. It actually wasn't. It was in the stimulus package after the big recession in 2008, 2009, when, if you recall, they threw $700 billion of the US economy for, quote, shovel-ready projects. And a couple of smart health policy types in Washington said, oh, I have a shovel-ready project that's a little different than roads and bridges, which is what they were talking about. How about if we take $30 billion and use it to incent hospitals and doctors to put in electronic health records? The act was called high tech. The standards they needed to meet were called meaningful use. And that's what happened. And I think probably a very smart thing to do. For $30 billion, they got a $4 trillion system to go from analog to digital. So a very big deal. Now, I can tell you that as we went to digital, I was incredibly excited about this. After all, I love my iPhone. I like Amazon. I like Netflix, all these things. We've all learned to use digital. It seems pretty straightforward and pretty clever. who goes to a travel agent anymore, who manages their finances in any other way other than digital. So that was my sense of medicine. What could possibly go wrong as we digitize? So I'm going to summarize a 300-page book because I spent a year of my life trying to understand why it had gone so wrong. So I'm going to summarize the 300-page book in 2 or 3 slides, mainly to give you a deep appreciation for how difficult this is and how wrong it can go if we're not careful. Because I really believe we're entering a new phase, and we won't make the same mistakes, but we'll probably make different mistakes. So here are a couple of examples of things that went wrong that at least I wasn't smart enough to anticipate. 7-year-old girl went to see her doctor, a pediatrician, several years ago, and she's something of an artist, and she drew this beautiful drawing of her recollection of the visit to the doctor. And you see there in the middle is the girl, next to her mother, in the corner her sister, and there in the other corner, back to the patient, typing away, is the doctor. This is what she recalled of her visit to the doctor. I'm guessing this is not unfamiliar to any of you. This is what life is like in medicine. And how can the girl and how can her mom have any impression other than the doctor cares more about the computer than he cares about me? I think it's a fantastic drawing. One thing the girl got wrong, anybody catch it? It's the smile on the doctor's face. I know of absolutely 0 physicians who are happy about becoming very expensive, very bad data entry clerks. But that is what happened as we computerized. We found ourselves spending huge amounts of time entering data into the computer. And part of what made people so unhappy about their computers was the feeling I'm putting all this stuff in and I'm getting very little useful out of it. If you had a baby and you spent all your time feeding and changing the baby and the baby never smiled at you, think about how you'd feel about that. That's sort of how we felt about our electronic health records. Now, how did we fix this? Did we fix the electronic health record? Not really. Anybody know the fix that people have come up with? No, my charts made it worse. The fix we came up with was scribes. So scribes, we now have about 100 to 150 scribes that work at UCSF that are basically another person in the room who's there to feed the computer so the doctor can actually take care of the patient. I'm a little proud of scribes. Scribes were brought to national attention sort of tangentially by me. My wife writes for the New York Times. And one day, and about this time, 2015 or 16, I came home and I said, honey, do you know how every other industry computerizes and immediately starts laying people off? Only in healthcare could we figure out a way of computerizing and adding another person in the room to feed the computer. That is the efficiencies of digitization. And so we are using scribes. And as far as I can tell, it's basically the only thing that gets us out of this predicament, some other person entering the room to feed the computer. So I didn't anticipate that. I know very few people who did. Here's just another measure of how things did not go as we anticipated. This is an ad I found around 2015 for an emergency medicine job in the state of Arizona. And starts out, Arizona General Hospital is coming to Grand Canyon State. It's in a Phoenix suburb. It's a little tiny, quote, boutique general hospital. It sounds kind of sweet. And then the ad starts. Here's what we are offering. We have an ER, which is good if you're looking for an ER doc, you want to have an ER. Radiology suite with some of the latest gizmos, little tiny place, 2 ORs, outpatient surgery, 16 inpatient rooms. But there was only one part of the ad in bold. They clearly thought this was their main selling point. We have no electronic medical record. On this advertisement, they said, you can come here and write on pieces of dead trees rather than using a modern computer to do your work. So I think this was sort of emblematic of what went wrong. So let me tell you what were the lessons that I learned from that, because I think these lessons are applicable as we enter the next phase of healthcare digitization. Here's one lesson. I think that health IT is going to go through 4 semi-discrete stages. And there's some overlap between them, but I found this conceptual model has been helpful to me in thinking this through. The first is you have to digitize the record. So nothing can happen until the data that you want to record about a patient begins life in digital form. I was on Google's advisory board in 2008, 2009 when Google tried to do Google Health. They took it down after about a year and said, this is too hard. I remember Eric Schmidt coming in and saying, this is too hard for us. And I was like, whoa, that's hard. But it was too hard for them because the record was mostly on pieces of paper and there was nothing googly they could do until it was digital. So you have to digitize the record. clearly done that. Next is what is sort of under the broad rubric of interoperability, meaning connecting all the digital parts. Now, 5 or 6 years ago, and when I wrote my book, what I mostly was thinking of was your Epic system to another hospital Cerner system, or a hospital or an ambulatory practice that uses a different ambulatory system to your hospital's Epic system. That remains important, but I think the big issue is B now. The big issue is third-party patient-facing systems to your Epic system and to one another. The digital blood pressure cuff, the digital glucometer, the digital scale, the digital toilet, the Apple Watch, how does that all connect into one another and ultimately to your enterprise system? The third is, what's the purpose of all this digital data? The purpose is to glean meaningful insights from all that data that's now sloshing around through your digital tubes, so you can be smarter about predicting things or giving decision support to people. And the hardest of all is converting those insights into something that actually improves healthcare value. Value being shorthand for quality, safety, access, equity, good stuff divided by how much it costs. So here's my personal scorecard. I think we've done that by and large. We've sort of done a little bit of this, but not very well. Certainly Epic systems connect well to other Epic systems, but don't play well with Cerner systems. It's not easy at all to bring in a third-party app. It certainly doesn't plug and play like something from the App Store does. I think we've done virtually none of this, and we've done virtually none of this. So part of what's so disappointing is I think we're in the earliest stages of this, where we've really scratched the surface of things we had to do that were foundational for the rest of it. But this is the work, and I've heard about some of the work going on here. We're doing similar work at our place that really are designed to say, okay, great, we have these big computer systems. What do we now do to improve the way we deliver care? And that is not trivial, and it does not flow directly from your $200 million purchase of an Epic system. It's a separate body of work. You have to organize yourself for it differently. You have to resource it. It's not easy. Now, part of the reason I think I'm reasonably ahead of the game on this is my older son works in an industry that has done all 4 of these things. And periodically, we'll get into an argument about whose work is more important. And he'll say, Dad, obviously mine is, because we invested in this 20 years ago. We've been doing it forever. And my job is actually number 3 and number 4. And there are about 10 or 15 people in my organization that has about 200 or 300 employees whose job is number 3 and number 4. And I say, oh, okay, yeah, I guess you probably are a little bit ahead of us. He works in Major League Baseball. And that's him and his wife on the field at the Atlanta Braves Stadium 6 months ago as they won the World Series. His ring will arrive in the mail in the next few weeks, so very exciting. The goggles were because they all spray each other with champagne, so that's that idea. But he can tell you that this guy cannot hit a lone outside curveball on Tuesday nights when the wind is out of the southwest and the pitcher is over 6'2". And he asked me, like, what can you do? And I say, oh, we have these sepsis alerts, and we're pretty good. They're only wrong about 30% of the time, but they're getting better. And he says, what else? And I said, no, that's pretty much it. So, they are light years ahead of us because they saw, if you read Moneyball, they saw the business case to invest in analytics. And every team now recognizes that they have all this data that they collect on every single pitch and play, and they analyze it up and down and sideways. And that analysis helps them play better, win more games, translates into a return on investment. And we, I think, have not realized that, in part because we didn't even get around to digitizing the record in the first place until the last 5 years. I think a second epiphany I had about the first 10 years of healthcare digitization that I think is important to recognize as we think about the next 10 years is this idea that comes from Ron Heifetz from the Harvard Kennedy School, who talked about adaptive versus technical problems. Technical problems, you would think health IT is a technical problem. Obviously, it's a technology. But adaptive problems are, as he says, problems that require people themselves to change. And adaptive problems, the people are the problem and the people are the solution. And leadership is about mobilizing them and engaging the people with the problem rather than to trying to anesthetize them so you can go off and solve it on your own. I think we tended to approach health IT as a technical problem, sort of logical. And I think we've come to recognize that it's the mother of all adaptive problems, that we can't get it right just by airlifting in a technology, turning on the switch and not thinking really deeply about the work and the workflow and the people and the culture and the change management. And I think that is one of the profound lessons that we have all learned over the last 10 years. Okay, so that's kind of all I want to say about the digitization of healthcare. Tomorrow morning, I'll talk more broadly about what that means and where we're going. But Tom asked me to talk about AI, so let's do that. So let's focus now on, based on what we've learned so far, what about AI? So let me reassure you that there will be no math. Here is my CV, and I should point out you're dealing with a political science major, not a computer science major. But to say, when I became chair of my department, and I have about 150 basic scientists in my department, and they were wondering, like, what the hell's going on here with this guy as chair? And I met with them and I said, I want to reassure all of you that I was a science major in college. And then I said, political science, which I thought was hilarious. And they were stone-faced. This was like, this is worse than we thought. This is really going to be bad. Anyway, I don't know the first thing about coding. I don't know what this is. I don't know what this is. I don't know what that is. And when it comes to AI, my level of understanding is sort of like this cartoon. There's kind of a bunch of math. There's a bunch of math on the other side, and there's a miracle that occurs in the middle, and that is AI. So for those of you that do this and understand the technical piece of it, kudos to you. It's really important that people do. The crux of what I'm going to talk about is not AI and how well it works and the nuances of machine learning versus deep learning. I kind of get what it's about, but I don't think that is the most important thing for at least what we're talking about today, which really is about the use of this new technology and new set of skills to transform the way we deliver healthcare. So AI obviously has entered the rest of our lives, and we're used to Google anticipating what we're thinking about as we do a search. We're used to Netflix suggesting stuff to us. We're used to our GPS systems telling us where to go. In San Francisco, this is about every other car in San Francisco is one of these driverless cars running around, and at least so far they seem reasonably safe. So we're used to this. It is certainly intercalated itself in every part of our life, but really hasn't taken off in healthcare. Now, it's not a new concept in healthcare. AI in the 70s and 80s, some leading edge people, including some folks that were here and other places around the country that were the cutting edge here, began to use early AI, less sophisticated methods than they have now. But the first thing they decided to work on was diagnosis. And I've actually interviewed some of them for my book and asked them, why did you do that? And they said, it just seemed like the most interesting problem. It just seemed like doctors take in all this data, it sloshes around in your brain, and you say, this is a pulmonary embolism, or this is cellulitis, or whatever. And it just seemed like we should be able to come up with a computer that takes in information, sloshes around, and comes up with a diagnosis. The problem is it did not work at all, or worked really sort of not well enough to be ready for prime time. And I thought it was captured very nicely in this cartoon, which came out in the era. Rapid pulse, sweating, shallow breathing. According to the computer, you've got gallstones, he says to this guy with an arrow in his back. So this was sort of the way people thought about AI in the early days. And it really failed. There were a bunch of systems that were developed in a number of academic places, some at Harvard, some at Pittsburgh, a few other places, and none of them caught on because they just were not good enough to really be valuable. And what that led to is what is sometimes called the AI winter, where basically AI in healthcare went away for almost a couple of decades. So it's back now. And it's back in a big way. This is a partial list of startups that are in the AI space. And you see in almost every part of healthcare, ranging from remote monitoring to imaging and diagnostics to virtual assistants, clinical trials, mental health, there are AI companies funded by venture capital trying to say, now is the time. There's now, all the data are in digital form. Think about what the healthcare system does. It takes data from a history, a physical lab test, it processes it, makes recommendations, prescribes, prognosticates. Why shouldn't we now be able to do that with AI? Because the data are beginning life in digital form. And I think ultimately we will. And here are some of the questions that I think will eventually be answered or tasks addressed by AI and big data. So I think diagnosing a condition, like teaching a computer to identify cases of lung cancer from path slides, is already happening. predicting risk for developing a disease or an outcome, so predicting sepsis or sepsis mortality based on electronic health record data. I heard about the project here where you are predicting the chances of a patient needing hospice or coding over a period of time, and that is leading to an action, which is recommending or at least considering goals of care discussions, sort of a very clever and I think forward-thinking use of predictive analytics. Predicting a treatment response, so predicting the response of a treatment for hypertension or cancer based on, for example, genetic data, clearly already happening in certain parts of healthcare, a little bit in cardiology, a fair amount in oncology, sort of leading edge fields. And then improving practice, predicting clinic demand or OR demand or no-shows, or helping a physician complete a note by using a digital scribe, are all tasks that seem amenable to or intractable for AI-based solutions. Let me take you through a few of these and what they might look like. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Fugitive. I love that movie with Harrison Ford. And one of the most memorable scenes, if you recall, Harrison Ford has been wrongly accused of murdering his wife, and he's got to go back to his hospital, which was a fictional version of Cook County Hospital, and he's a physician. And he goes back in disguising himself or playing that he's an orderly, and is asked to take a patient, wheel a patient down to the OR, and he pulls up the x-ray and realizes the patient has an undiagnosed tension pneumothorax. And he alerts the physician, and the physician takes the patient to the OR and saves the patient's life. It's a pretty cool scene. So what it's really about is Harrison Ford, because he's Harrison Ford, being able to pick up this x-ray and recognize that there's some terrible illness on it. And you would think that maybe our digital x-ray machines could do that, and in fact now they can. And this is a technology that we actually co-developed and are working with GE. It's now part of GE's new x-ray system. But you see here that here's an x-ray. It looks okay to me, looks a little fuzzy, but a pneumothorax is detected. This is by the AI system. And so this, what might the use case for this be? Use case might be portable x-rays being done all night, and the radiologist is going to come in at 8 in the morning and look at all of them. The x-ray actually can say there's pneumothorax in this patient, it needs to be read stat. So clever, and the test characteristics of this are quite good. It's quite accurate in picking up pneumothorax. In addition, so this is a Path slide. This is a company called Path AI that just got $165 million of funding because it reads the Path slides essentially as well as the pathologist. And here is a company that was developed by a startup in San Francisco. So this is a digital scribe. I told you that we have hired about 100 scribes to help our ambulatory physicians take care of their patients and actually make eye contact. We're now shifting a lot of that work to digital scribes, where there's this Alexa-like device in the room. I'm always worried that there's going to be an Alexa in the audience that's going to ask me like what I want. There's an Alexa-like device in the room. It hears the note, and at least for simple notes, it's now able to serve the function that a scribe can begin to write the note. And you might say, no big deal, you know, that's called dictation software, but you can't take a dictation of an encounter with a patient and have that be your note. It's got to be taken and processed into what then looks like a note. And so there are several companies in the space, and they're now pretty good. So I think that's going to be ready for prime time soon. And here's another example that is in the works. There are some early examples of this. This is flight path monitoring. And this is the idea of most patients follow a fairly predictable trajectory. And the same thing true with flights. When Tom flies tonight to Washington, if his plane veers off a path, there will be somebody who notices that and begins communicating with the plane. You're not flying in the predicted path. That's something AI can do very well based on the last 100,000 patients it's seen that look like this patient. Your patient is taking a different path, or your treatment is different, and warning you about that, alerting you to that. So in medicine, it might look like patients like this. You said the patient had pneumonia, you start the patient on the usual antibiotics, but patients like this are usually afebrile by now. You might want to rethink your diagnosis. Or if the computers are programmed to be a little bit snarky, you might see, it's very unusual to see a patient who has a GI bleed still on an anticoagulant. You're either very innovative or very wrong. So we might see things like that where the computer is monitoring how we're doing and telling us this seems like an exception to what we would expect. All things that are well within the ability of AI to do. So I spent a little bit of time talking about what might go wrong and some of the complexities here. Let's assume AI gets everything right, makes the right diagnosis, predictions, outliers, can do an electronic health record note. Then what? And I've shown here a picture of Sundar Pichai, who's the CEO of Google, showing something that Google has sorted out, which is a picture of the retina. And not only can they, from this picture, diagnose diabetes and predict the hemoglobin A1C and predict the patient's blood pressure, all things that ophthalmologists can do, but they can also predict the patient's age and gender, something ophthalmologists cannot do. And when you try to query, like, how is it doing that, at least the Google folks I've spoken to say, we actually don't know. We just know that if you throw in 1 million images and you then at the end say, and it turned out that this person was a male and this person was a female, the computer can figure out who's who at a level of detail that even a trained subspecialist who's trained to do this cannot do, based on their level of detection. So it's pretty staggering what these things are able to do. But here are the concerns, and I hope I've convinced you from the first 5 or 10 years of the electronic health record era that just figuring out the technology is step one and you have not solved the problem. There are more complicated things. So I'm going to give you what I think are the traditional concerns about AI. I think they're talked about enough that happy to explore any of these during the Q&A, but I'm not going to go into great detail because I think they're now, everybody kind of gets these. There's the garbage in, garbage out problem. So a lot of AI is only as good as the data that it is reviewing. And we all know that, that the data in the medical record sometimes crosses that subtle line between nonfiction and fiction, that we are all incented to write our notes in a certain way to create the maximum bill or the maximum complexity, which has certain advantages in quality measurement and all sorts of things. And so if the data are inaccurate or are biased in a certain direction, then the results that you get from the AI are going to also be of dubious accuracy. Data from one organization, given patient population, let's say, or a given setting may not be relevant to another. So a big study that used AI that came out of WashU may or may not be relevant to a patient population in San Francisco. There's the black box phenomenon. Will clinicians follow predictions and recommendations whose derivations they don't understand or that have no obvious biologic plausibility? Will if the AI is reading that this patient is, just some of the ophthalmologic results I gave you, if it gives you a result and you don't understand where that came from, and you're trying to sort out what data did it cue on to say this patient has a bad predicted outcome, for example, will they believe it if they don't understand where it came from? I think that's an open question. And will there be a mechanism to follow up on accuracy and effectiveness and to iterate? I'll get back to that in a second, but a lot of AI algorithms are built at time zero, are launched, and don't have a way to continuously improve based on their test performance. And there's a risk there that they will not do as well over time as they move out into real life. Plenty of ethical issues, biases, and disparities. For example, an AI algorithm might say, it looks like African-American patients with fractures require less pain medicine because when we've looked at the last 1,000 Black patients in the ER, they got less pain medicine than white patients. And that may be emblematic of a bias rather than the right thing to do. But AI can't tell the difference between that. It may just simply mimic and codify that practice. And melanoma detection is less accurate in darker skin problems. So there are technical issues as well. And then the huge issue of the digital divide. If more and more of our care is delivered digitally, what if patients who don't have good bandwidth and good wireless and iPhones and all that kind of stuff? There's sort of obvious issues that we're all struggling with. And then the privacy and security issues. Can the algorithms get hacked? You're taking huge amounts of data and amalgamating. It's one thing if you do it, everybody will trust you. But what if you are doing it by sending your data off to Google or to Amazon or to one of the big companies? Will people trust that? So these are, I'd say, the traditional concerns. And they're all very real and things we have to work our way through. I want to spend my time with you today talking about other areas that I hear talked about less, but to me seem to be areas that we're going to have some AI-related speed bumps. First of all, how is this actually going to work in real life? And so we are going to have more and more data collected on patients in their regular life, not when they come into our office to see us, but at home, in the bathroom, stepping on the scale, sitting on the toilet, whatever it is, how is that data going to be processed? And we're going to need AI to be involved there, or else we're going to be massively overwhelmed by data. I think there will be an AI version of the patient safety movement, and the first 10 years of digital has been that a typical response to, for example, the patient's not acting the way we thought, or we have something we want to tell you, doctor or nurse, is to have a best practice alert or something that alerts you. And the problem, of course, is if you overwhelm people with alerts, they don't work very well. People will learn to ignore them. And then a problem called data set shift that I'll describe in a second. Second issue, how good is good enough? And I say, kind of liken that to the driverless car problem. So if you have over the control of this really important thing to a technology, what happens when the technology fails? And I think we're beginning to learn that with the driverless car. What happens if a driverless car gets into a fatal accident, and how will we approach that? The issue of de-skilling. So until and unless the computers and the AI completely takes over for all of us, we're going to be in this weird hybrid world where you're going to have real people working side by side with computers. And one of the things that happens that is predictable but not good is that the humans start turning their brains off. They start not being as good at the skill as they used to be when they had to do it completely themselves. And that can lead to its own set of problems. And then I want to spend a minute or two on the politics and economics of AI, which will obviously heavily influence how quickly it takes over our world. So let me start with something. I'll show this again tomorrow because I think this is foundational to understanding digital transformation. But we are now entering a world where patients are going to have various tools at home, their smart watch or their digital scale or their digital glucometer. And that data has to go somewhere. And assuming they have a doctor here who takes care of them or another clinician who takes care of them, the obvious solution is that data comes to that clinician. And I'll hear periodically people who are kind of digital optimists say things like, how great is that going to be? That the primary care doctors are going to get all of this fantastic rich data on each of their 1,600 patients. And my response is that's a world I'm not familiar with. The world I'm familiar with is if I say I'm turning that on this afternoon, the 300 primary care doctors that work in my department will all quit by 5 o'clock this afternoon. No question. It is simply this kind of flow of information cannot be bolted onto the current chassis of American medicine without breaking it in about 5 minutes. And so there needs to be a new layer built into the healthcare system. And I know you're beginning to work on this here. We are as well, but we're very far away from having it done. And I and John Hlomka, I think might have been the first person to say this, call these care traffic controllers. So the layer here is somebody who is not the frontline clinician monitoring the patient's digital signals in a way their traffic control is monitoring all those planes out there to see how they're doing. And when they are going out off the path, something happens. And the something happens cannot be the primary care doctor has to do something in each of these 1,500 patients. It simply can't work. So what might the care traffic controllers do? Patient 112 sugar is high again. The algorithm bumped the insulin, but let's get the coach involved. So there's an AI piece here that maybe that's the AI is the first responder. It recognizes the patient is not doing what we expect the patient would do. It maybe even makes a clinical recommendation to change the insulin dose. That's not working. It also has to recognize the patient is still not responding, and now a human being gets involved, and it's going to have to triage who is that human being. Is that a pharmacist? Is that a doctor? Is that a primary care doctor, an endocrinologist? Complicated. Patient 42 has a regular heart rate and is short of breath. Let's do a televisit as soon as possible. That might happen. And then in the world, this is probably 5 years out from all of this, in the world of the Internet of Things where your entire house is wired, patient 13's weight is up and oxygen saturation is worse. I'll lock the salt shaker and the refrigerator. So not only do you have behavioral prompts, but you actually have forcing functions that don't let people do certain things. This is all coming. I saw a story today as we're talking about monitoring wastewater for COVID rates in communities of the wired toilet that will monitor wastewater one toilet at a time. There is I hate to get too bathroom oriented here, but there's some interesting things. There's a company that has built into the toilet seat a way to monitor a patient's vital signs. They just got $35 million of venture capital funding. And how long will it be before your urine is analyzed and all of that data? It's all cool. Like, where does that go? Who does what with it? Clearly, AI has to have a role there, assuming this all happens. But I think this is coming to a bathroom near you. I'll spend a minute talking about alert fatigue, because if you think about, all right, AI is making a prediction or demonstrating that the patient is going outside of the path. Now what? And I think the now what, it may be the hardest question of all. The now what in the first 10 years of the electronic health record era was, okay, great, we're going to alert the doctor or alert the nurse. Sounds great. This is one of my favorite studies. This is a nurse researcher at UCSF in 2014, looked at our ICUs, and we had 70 ICUs. And in each ICU, 70 ICU beds, in each ICU, of course, they have a bedside monitor. And it's basically monitoring 5 or 6 parameters. It's monitoring heart rate and respiratory rate and oxygen saturation, EKG tracing, blood pressure. And it's got parameters of highs and lows. And if you go outside that parameter, it throws off an alert. Makes all the sense in the world. So the question Barbara asked was, in a month at UCSF across these 70 ICU bed monitors, how many times is an audible or visible alert thrown off? Anybody want to take a guess? Mark, what do you think? Thousands and thousands. Take a guess how many thousands? Yeah, all 70 beds in a month. 999,000, I think, is what he was saying. All right, so that's pretty good. The answer is 2.5 million in a month. There was one audible alert every 7 minutes. When I interviewed Barbara for my book, she told me the story of standing by a patient's bedside. And the alerts were going off like every 6, 7 minutes, and she was jumping. The nurse by the bedside was calm. And Barbara said, what would make you worried that something was going wrong? And the nurse thought for a second, and then she said, silence. She said, if there were no alerts, I'd be really worried something was wrong, which is in Seinfeld, you remember Bizarro World, where everything is backwards? That is Bizarro World, that she's using the lack of an alarm to tell her that maybe something's wrong. So if AI's effector arm is alert the clinician, I'm not sure that we have wired this. We've not figured out how to get around this problem of alert fatigue. And here is the sepsis version of it. Epic's detected the patient's hypotensive, and it throws off an alert, and we're just learning to ignore these by and large, in part because they're wrong too often. And that's true of all the drug interactions and every other alert that we're getting used to. So this is a problem, the issue of a clinical decision support, how to deliver it in a way that works, doesn't have too many false alarms, that maybe AI will ultimately help with, because you can imagine the ICU problem. Maybe one of the things you do is these are not dumb alerts that go off if any of those 5 parameters are violated, but alerts that are integrated that say, for this kind of alert, the clinician always just silences it. So when this kind of alert in this kind of patient goes off, we're not going to throw the alert because it's clear that it's wrong. Or for this kind of alert, it says the patient's in VTAC at 200, but the blood pressure didn't change. That's physiologically impossible. So we're not going to throw an alert. So, you can imagine AI getting involved and making more sense out of the physiologic signals. But right now, this mostly doesn't happen. This is the notion of data set shift that came up in a recent paper in STAT, which I thought was pretty interesting. And basically, this is the performance of a sepsis model that was analyzed at MIT. And the sepsis model you see performed pretty well in the first couple of years with an area under the curve of 75%. That's not bad. And then the clinicians changed to a different coding system when ICD-10 came out. And all of a sudden, the performance of the algorithm fell terribly down to something that was essentially a coin flip. It was no better than a coin flip. But there was no mechanism to recognize that the algorithm, which had worked fine on day one, was no longer working. Everyone was blithely going along using the algorithm. And you could see that happening more and more and more as we put out these algorithms, don't have a mechanism to iteratively demonstrate and test they're still doing what we hope they would do. So that's going to be a problem that we have to spend some energy on. And in the paper, they said these findings strongly suggest a vexing culprit known as data set shift. It occurred when data evolved with the world around them, but the algorithm remained locked in the time period in which it was trained. like an explorer navigating with an outdated map. Eventually, it becomes hopelessly lost. I think it's a nice way of framing it. Let's spend a minute on the driverless car problem. Should we trust AI in life and death situations? This was the first, I think, the first fatal crash of a driverless car that was reported. This is a Tesla crash that was reported, I think, in about 2016, 17. And it did not stop, didn't see that there was a trailer there. The trailer had a certain color. The car's monitors didn't pick it up. And basically it drove, the Tesla drove right into this trailer truck, veered off the road, and yet a couple of people died. And of course, this becomes a huge headline that, look, we should not have trusted this driverless car because it was 2018, because it got into this terrible crash, which of course is natural. And we're going to do that, and we'll do that in medicine too, as we trust AI to do something. The minute it does it badly and something bad happens, we will immediately finger point and say, I told you so, partly because deep down, we're rooting for the humans. I think we are humans, and if it's AI versus us, there's a part of us that does not want to believe that a computer could do this better than us. The problem is that's not quite fair, because to make a huge fuss about this autopilot crash, which I completely understand, doesn't take into account that 20,000 people died between 2012 and 2017 of crashes involving distracted drivers, which theoretically the driverless car will solve. The fact that you're looking at your phone, or you're intoxicated, or you're distracted, and you're in an argument, or whatever it is, shouldn't matter if it's a driverless car. So really, we should be able to do apples to apples and say, yes, there was a driverless car crash of the Tesla. That's terrible. We need to fix it. But how many crashes does it avert by preventing distracted driver problems? That's a very difficult sort of problem for humans to work through and see in a completely neutral, let's weigh the number of fatalities and accidents in one pile or another and treat them the same. We probably won't be able to do that. I want to spend a minute on de-skilling. It is an absolutely predictable phenomenon that if you give up some of your authority and autonomy to a technology, that you will start being bad at it, assuming that you used to be good at it because you were doing it using that part of your brain all the time. I have to confess to you that I really don't remember my wife's cell phone number. And if I ever lost my cell phone, I might never see her again. And it's just because my brain's kind of full and I'm not making any new neurons, and I don't want to sort of fill it up with things I don't need to remember anymore. And that's sort of a version of de-skilling. That was a skill I used to have. I used to remember a bunch of phone numbers. I don't remember phone numbers anymore. Don't really remember driving directions anymore. I just depend on the technology. And that's a good trade-off. By and large, the technology works and solves the problem. The problem is in transitional periods where you still depend on the humans to do certain things. The technologies are not completely autonomous. The de-skilling can get you into trouble. And this is going to be something we're going to have to work through in healthcare. My favorite example comes from aviation. So you may not know this, but up until about 30 or 40 years ago, in a cockpit of a big plane, you had 3 people in the cockpit. You had the pilot, the co-pilot, and a flight engineer who was sort of looking at the maps, believe it or not. And in the 70s, I think they ditched the flight engineer. They said, we don't need that anymore. So you only had 2 people in the plane. And there are people that talk about the nearly full automation of modern airplanes that really do essentially fly themselves. And the lingo, or you hear people talk about this periodically, that in the future airplane, there won't be 2 pilots in the cockpit. There will be a pilot and a dog. And the idea is the pilot is there to keep the dog company. The dog is there to bite the pilot if he tries to touch the controls, because the thing is flying by itself. And as long as the pilot keeps his hand off, it'll be fine. So that's cute. And probably there's some accuracy in that. But then periodically we have crashes of airplanes. And when you look at the sort of root cause analysis of crashes, of modern crashes of airplanes, they often have a similar flavor, which is the technology went on the glitch, something went wrong. The pilots now had to fly a plane that they really didn't know how to fly anymore because they had lost that set of skills. I interviewed Captain Sullenberger for my book, The Pilot Who Landed on the Hudson. And we talked about some of these crashes, and and there was an Air France crash off the coast of Brazil. And he said they were young pilots. They were not trained the way I was trained. He was trained flying gliders. He was in the Air Force. He said when the technology didn't help them, he said they found themselves flying a plane that they were not familiar with. They did not know how to fly the plane. And this also happened with the 737 MAX. You remember the couple of accidents where basically the computers glitched, the information coming into the computer system was giving the computer the wrong airspeed. The way the system was set up was it assumed the plane was going up too much and it was started forcing the nose down. And 2 flights crashed. The first one was a Lion Air flight. And in this really terrific article by William Langewiesche, who writes about aviation safety for the Times, he chronicled what happened because most senior experienced pilots say, yes, this was a huge surprise that all of a sudden they're flying and all of a sudden, for reasons they did not understand, the nose of the plane starts pushing itself down. And they were unable to get themselves out of that. But they said, the senior pilot said, I think that a senior pilot might have been able to do it. And he wrote this in this article. His experience, he was referring to the co-pilot, his experience with flying was scripted, bounded by checklists and cockpit mandates, and dependent on autopilots. He had some rote knowledge of cockpit procedures as handed down by the big manufacturers, but he was weak in an essential quality known as airmanship. Sadly, his captain turned out to be weak in it too. Airmanship is an anachronistic word, but is applied without prejudice to women as well as men. Its full meaning is difficult to convey. It includes a visceral sense of navigation, an operational understanding of weather and weather information, the ability to form mental maps of traffic flows, fluency in the nuance of radio communications, and especially a deep appreciation for the interplay between energy, inertia, and wings. Airplanes are living things. The best pilots do not sit in cockpits so much as strap them on. I think that's a beautiful piece of writing, and basically it's about de-skilling. It's that they no longer had the skill to manage an unexpected situation when the technology didn't give them an out. And the medicine analogy, I hope, is completely clear. The skills that we, for those of us who've been around at this for a while, have around the physical exam or other things, probably will not be as sharp in younger people who are trained in a year where the computer is doing more and more for them. You have to always be careful about the days of the giants, and we were so much smarter and better. That mostly turns out to be wrong. But it is true that during the period of time where the technology is coming into place, taking over a bunch of tasks, but is not perfect and is not completely taking over the task, you have this risk of de-skilling that we're going to have to figure out our way through. Spend just last minute on the political economics of healthcare AI. This may turn out to be the bumpiest thing of all and why AI does not come into healthcare as quickly as it did in Netflix or Amazon or you name your favorite industry where it's largely taken over. So there will be pressure for value. There will be competition that will push care toward tech-enabled solutions. So clearly in every industry, they try to figure out ways of using the technology to have less expensive people do tasks that you used to require more expensive people to do. So all the arrows here are from specialists to generalists, physicians to non-physician clinicians, to coaches, to patients and families, with technology then allowing those people, lesser trained and less expensive, to do things that you previously needed this more expensive person to do. That part's clear. Patients willing, and some people say, well, patients are still going to want to pay for, want to see the fanciest specialists. Patients' willingness to pay for the higher priced or more personal entities rather than getting their care from a robot or from AI will be determined empirically. So in medicine, you can see, there are people that are willing to pay $10,000 a year to have a physician who sees a patient every 45 minutes, not every 12 minutes. Who sees a travel agent? People who have really complex travel needs and can afford it. Who sees a person to prepare their taxes rather than using TurboTax if you have complex needs and can afford it? And I think people will still do that, but it may be that the baseline care is delivered more by AI. And that includes the value that people place on the human touch and on empathy. I hear this a lot. Patients really are going to need to see doctors because they want that human touch. Maybe. I think we'll see. We'll see. I, used to enjoy talking to my bank teller. I'm perfectly happy never to see a bank teller again. I used to love meeting with my travel agent. I haven't seen a travel agent for 10 years. Financial planning, all those things, I'm perfectly comfortable. If the technology can do it and I can do it at home. I think many people will do these things. There may be certain areas where people really prize the human touch, or they may be willing to spend additional money to get it. There may be some tasks that incumbents are happy to lose. They're menial, rote, poorly paid, especially if there's more interesting and or more lucrative replacement work. So the question is, AI comes into our world, will the incumbents fight it? And the answer is, in certain parts of our world, no, not at all. They'll be perfectly happy to give it up. But when there isn't, you can expect a massive pushback from the incumbents. And I tell people in tech all the time that physicians are better at defending their turf than taxi drivers. So if your experience of taking over an industry is what you learned with Uber, recognize that that's not completely applicable to taking over medical tasks. Much of it depends on who's at risk for the cost and quality of care. Medicine is very complicated because of the intermediary role of insurance companies. And the malpractice system will also have a vote. Of course, the technology companies will say, we're not practicing medicine, still the doctor that ultimately reads the x-ray, even if the AI has read 100 x-rays and the doctor is signing off in that last step. But the malpractice system will determine whether the company or the physician is liable. If machine learning and AI is ultimately better and cheaper, or it's cheaper and not demonstrably worse, I can't see how it doesn't win in as we think about medical practice. I can see it being the standard way that people get a lot of their care, and people can afford it, afford better insurance, or afford paying out of pocket, just like they might for concierge care, are able to buy up to more personal care. That certainly is true in many other industries. Now, this is a point of the talk where you often hear that, well, it won't be or, it will be and. And a lot of data supports the idea that computers working with people are better than computers alone and better than people alone. And the example of chess is often given. I was just talking to a very senior person to Google Health recently who said, we're not out there to replace physicians. No, we want to work with them. I have to tell you, when I hear that, my BS detector goes off because maybe they know politically that if they say they're there to replace physicians, there'll be massive pushback. But ultimately, of course, they want to replace physicians. Every industry that's building digital tools wants to ultimately take over as much of that enterprise as possible. And so we will see how this goes. But I consider that when you hear that statement, it's warm and fuzzy and slightly political. So finishing up, what will we do and what should we think? I think AI will ultimately transform healthcare, decreasing the friction in processes, cutting waste, pushing care to lower cost and more convenient people, organizations, and technology. And I think that's actually going to move along with the Great Resignation. As we have more trouble finding enough nurses or anyone else in the healthcare world, and we're having it now, you might not have said we need to think about a robot or AI to do this, but if you can't find enough people, you will think that pretty quickly. It will be a massively bumpy ride with iconic failures, political blowback, false starts, but I think it will ultimately triumph, and I'd say 2030 is about the time. I don't think AI is taking over healthcare in the next 3 to 5 years, but I do think as you think about the dynamics here, the data being all digital, the quality of the tools, the amount of money coming in venture capital, the involvement of the biggest digital companies in the world, I can't see how this doesn't take on a much larger role in healthcare over the next 10 years. I think the key for organizations thinking about doing this is to start with the easy stuff. Scheduling, triage, scribes, translation, maybe x-rays or path slides, maybe dermatology. The things that are about visual pattern recognition are easier than other things, even though they're not easy. Before trying for massive transformation, AI replacing an intensivist or oncologist or a primary care doctor, AI as a diagnostic engine. I think those come later than learning to use it to solve basic frictionful problems in the healthcare system. And I think good organizations will begin building the capacity to use AI thoughtfully to improve healthcare value. So, and this is a good organization, and I think you will do that, and you should do that, and recognize that we have to go into this with a huge amount of humility, because there are gonna be huge, I was about to say epic failures, I don't mean that. There are gonna be huge failures and speed bumps along the way. But ultimately, if we don't get into this, then we will not succeed as healthcare delivery organizations. It's just too important. What we do is too expensive. Too much of it is about the processing of data that I think we've got to figure out how to do it. So with that, let me stop, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions and comments. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Wachter. Any questions from the room here? We also have open QA online for our participants. So anyone in the room who might have a question? Yes, Dr. Powderly. Pardon me. I'm gonna run over
We'll do
and
the Phil Donahue thing.
yeah, that's right.
Oprah thing.
We are recording today,
Yeah.
so we want to capture the comments from the room.
And say who you are if you can.
So I'm Bill Powderly.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Bob. How are you?
Yeah, nice to see you.
So you touched on it and then said we know these issues have been addressed, but I'm going to challenge you a little bit about. So you talked about the fact that the data can be quite biased, particularly for minority groups.
Yes.
And then that there is a digital divide.
Yeah.
And what I hear all the time when people talk about social determinants is, oh, we know they're there. But nobody talks about, well, what are we going to do to actually fix it?
Yes.
And I think your last couple of slides actually are going to make it worse.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you saw the piece in the Times a couple of days ago about the Spanish retired professor who was forced the banks there to reintroduce teller service in Spain. And he, with a mass movement, because it completely disadvantages older people.
Yeah.
I may be very comfortable doing all my banking, but you know, if I have Parkinson's, as this gentleman had, and I'm 79 years of age, then it's a challenge.
Yes, of course. So yeah, first of all, I apologize. I did not mean to imply that we have solved all those other problems. I think they are massive problems. I meant to say that I think they're in sort of the common parlance as people talk about AI and people understand them. So I've just given a certain amount of time. I wanted to focus on a few other ones. All very real, all very important problems. In terms of the digital divide, I was on my high school debating team, and I'm not sure whether I would have been more comfortable taking side A. It's going to worsen the digital divide, make it more difficult for poor communities, minority communities, disenfranchised populations to access healthcare, or that it will actually improve things. If you think about people who are in rural areas and don't have access to healthcare, if you think about the ability to more customize how you communicate with people through digital means than we currently have. There are certain foundational pieces, which is obviously you're going to need to have wireless, you're going to need to have certain basic tools. And the question will be, does the payment system change? And we've been predicting this for 30 years and it hasn't happened very much, so this is not a good prediction. But if it changes to more of a value-based payment system, where the system is at risk for the total cost of care, then the system actually would have an incentive to making sure the patient has good wireless if they believe that doing so will allow us to manage their hypertension better, their diabetes better, prevent an ER visit. So I think a lot of it hinges on that. If the system doesn't change that way, I think the digital divide will be an enormous issue. In terms of social determinants, I'm glad that we're talking about them now. I think we went a long time without even acknowledging that they existed. I think the ability to take account of them is going to be better in a digital environment where we can know where the patient lives, how much schooling the patient had, patients, maybe obviously insurance, maybe even their wealth, and factor that into predictions and determining what happens. I think we have a huge and then what question. And I think we have that digital or not. I mean, I think, you know, and I hear periodically organizations say, you know, it turns out that where the patient lives and their level of education is really determines their healthcare more than anything we can do. And so we're going to help buy or build housing. And it's like, we don't even know how to deliver healthcare well. Like, we're going to get into the housing business. The problem, I think, is going to be a political problem, which is if you say social determinants are really important, what you would do would be invest more money in preventing some of the social determinants. Where's that money going to come from? Probably some of it should come from the existing acute care system. And we, you know, we're good human beings. We believe in social determinants. We'll fight that like hell. We will say we need every cent that we're getting in order to do all this magnificent stuff that we do. So it's a really knotty problem, but I'm actually enthusiastic about the possibility that digital emerging in an era where we understand social determinants can build that into its sensibility in a way that I don't think we have in the existing system now, but we're gonna have to see how it goes. It's I think, a really important point.
Wonderful. We do have a question from Clarissa Kenyon, who is a previous member of our innovation lab. So happy to have her participating. Her question is, to develop accurate tools, AI companies need healthcare data as much as healthcare will need AI. How do you envision successful collaboration between industry and healthcare data resources taking shape?
It's also a terrific question. And I think it's a problem. I was talking to a couple of your key digital people this morning about this. For you to take your data and analyze it in any way you want, everybody says, great, it's your data. I mean, there's the sort of ambiguity about, is it your data or is it the patient's data and all that, but it's living in your Epic system. You have every ability to apply whatever AI magic you can to it. The minute that you say that we can't do that, we can't possibly build or buy the technologies and the kinds of people that we need to do the most advanced AI, even in a place like this or a place like mine, we have to work with, God forbid, Google. And therefore, we're going to have to send them our data. You're going to be in the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And so, and for completely understandable reasons. And so that's a real obstacle to innovation here, because there's no way that even the best and most sophisticated and largest and wealthiest academic health systems will be able to have the kind of technology tools and talent that exist in the corporate world. I can't see how it happens. Now, they'll have a lot, they'll be able to do a lot. But if it turns out that the magic here really comes from huge data sets, like 100x of what you have here, analyzed by computers that have power that is bigger and better than anything that you have here, done by people that are the world-class AI gurus, that's probably going to happen more in companies than it happens in our world. So it calls for a level of collaboration that should be relatively straightforward, but in a world of HIPAA and a world with huge skepticism of giving any data to Google or Facebook or you name it, that's an obstacle. It's interesting because if you say, I'm working with a startup that nobody's ever heard of, you're fine. But God forbid the startup has a name that everybody's heard of. It's like, no, you can't do that. And Ascension got into big hot water here in part because they kind of hid this, and then there was a code word, and then the Wall Street Journal did a big expose. That's not what you want. I think Mayo did it better. Mayo did a partnership with Google. We're very public about it. De-identified data, all that kind of stuff. I think there's another solution at which I spoke with some of your folks that you're working on here, which is called synthetic data, which is our synthetic patients, which is basically, can you take the data? The problem with de-identification is every sophisticated AI company can re-identify a patient very easily if you strip out the name and the zip code, and they can figure out who it is just from the creatinine and and the 3 or 4 other parameters. They can figure it out. The idea of synthetic patients is taking all the data, jumbling it so it loses any ability to identify a patient, but retaining the essential characteristics so it becomes useful for analytics and the building of algorithms. And that the science of that is improving very rapidly. There are a bunch of companies in that space. So it may be that synthetic patients becomes the solution to allow you and us to share data with companies that help us do this work. But I do think there's going to be a certain amount of this that we can do internally, but much of it is really going to require partnerships. It's just too big and too complicated.
Absolutely. We do have another question from a participant, Laura Cluse. With current nursing workforce constraints and nurses' vital role in patient experience, do you have thoughts on how AI may serve as a driver of further declining workforce? And how will these dynamics impact the patient experience?
Yeah, I guess conceptually the way I see this is that if you look at what nurses do and you look at what doctors do, there's an immense amount of activity that's stupid, that is wasted time, is well below their, if we say practicing at the top of their license, is stuff that they should not need to do. And some of it could be done by other people if they had technology tools that provided some piece of expertise that the nurse currently has. Some of it really doesn't require a person. Think about, go into a hospital floor and look at a patient pressing on a call button and a nurse trying to then answer and come into the room and change the IV pump, which is only in the room, as opposed to having a technology that could be monitoring all the IV pumps on a floor and do what it needs to do without all of that running around. I mean, I mean, we're already moving a little bit in that direction. You know, I don't know if you're using kind of electronic sitters, but, you know, I mean, you can't have enough people to put in all the rooms that need sitters. So what do we have? We have robots and they have cameras, and so you have someone who can monitor now 20 patients sitting at a station. It's the idea of scaling, you know, the expertise or replacing human tasks with others. And the hopeful view of that, and I am pretty hopeful about that, is you will boil it down to what is the essence of what you really need a human being to do. And I think that is a more satisfying job for a nurse. And I can imagine a world where you need a quarter less nurses, fewer nurses. And I can imagine a world where you need a quarter fewer physicians for much the same reasoning. That's not a year or two away. But I think the Great Resignation may be a big stimulus for it. Because I can tell you, every hospital in the world has been reluctant to make the investments in technology they probably should, because their margins are small and it seems like an uncertain investment, and they're not in a very competitive marketplace. And we're better off investing if we build a new hospital, we know what that's going to pay off. And if we buy a few neurosurgeons, we know what that's going to pay off. Much harder to sort of invest in technology, it just feels fuzzier. But if all of a sudden you've got to close down a floor because you can't staff it, because you can't hire enough nurses, all of a sudden you say, wow, you know, what are our nurses doing? And if we can take all of their tasks out and say, are there 20% of the things that they're currently doing that a good technology could do? And if we spend $5 million, we can do that. I think you have a dynamic where they will start thinking about buying that. If they start thinking about buying that, I can tell you venture capital will flow into that space and companies will build that. Part of the vicious cycle we have here is there's been no market for this stuff. So their companies have not emerged to build this stuff. So venture capital has not invested in this stuff. But if you change the dynamic and you say, we're going to need to figure out ways of changing the nature of what a nurse does, then there will be plenty of money and companies that say that's a really exciting space where, you know, we can make $1 billion.
Any other questions? Yes, Miss Denise Murphy, Nurse Murphy.
Denise will have a job because someone's gonna have to oversee this entire mess.
So thank you. That was wonderfully informative and always entertaining. It was
Thank you.
great. So where are we going with building into curricula change management? So I'm thinking about our virtual observer program and the fact that we've invested a lot of money in the equipment and getting everybody trained and hiring people. And the other day we had, I can't tell you how many opportunities through our central staffing office to have the virtual observer, the e-sitter, used. And we had across the health system, six people using it. And
why? So why weren't they?
well, that's a good question, but you know, I think all the time about how hard it is to change behavior in healthcare. I love the idea of the dog in the cockpit that bites the pilot if he goes to touch anything. So I really think that we have to start not only training people about the technology and the enabling that it brings and the relief that it will bring, hopefully job satisfaction and everything else. But we have such a fear of change in healthcare. It's amazing. You know, you've done that. I've heard you talk a million times about human factors and patient safety.
You know, we both grew up in the patient safety world together.
We
and
did.
That's all about change management. You know, we are pretty fat and happy in healthcare. I mean, it's not a particularly competitive environment. We sort of say, this is what you need to pay us, and somebody pays it to us. The need just grows and grows as the population ages. I mean, I mean, people say to me, oh, healthcare is, you know, being so disrupted by technology. I say, are you kidding? Like, how many unemployed doctors do you know? How many unemployed nurses do you know? How many hospitals really have closed? With all the threats, hospitals are going to close left and right. How many really have? You know, it's very, I mean, my wife's in journalism. I see what it looks like for an industry to be disrupted. This is not it. And so we can get away with, you know, sort of reluctance to change. You know, I can't do it that way. I've got to do this because we stay in business and it's fine. I think at some point that ends. And I'd be sure about that, except I've been saying at some point that ends for 20 years. and partly because I've been saying, and others have been saying, you know, you can find articles in 1990 that say the cost of healthcare is unaffordable. It's going to break the system. It's unsustainable. It's 11% of our gross domestic product. Well, now it's 18, and obviously it was sustainable because it's been sustained. It has to be at some point. It just is not. There's not enough money for the schools, for the police, for tax rates to stay manageable, all those sort of things. And I think technology may be what's it. It may not be that what breaks the system is competition from other organizations that also aren't very good at change and aren't very nimble. What breaks the system is new entrants that come in and begin eating our lunch. And I live in San Francisco. I advise several companies whose job it is, who are being built to take over a part of healthcare that they perceive is just fat and happy and not going to get their acts together. And when I look at what they're doing in the primary care space, it's pretty impressive and far better and far faster than anything we can do. Building the practice around a digital first way of thinking, using all the data in ways that we just don't. And so I think that they will begin winning in certain areas, not the whole thing, and they're not going to do liver transplants anytime soon. They're not going to do cabbages. But we're also going to be in a position if we start losing pretty big swaths of healthcare because we're so inefficient and we do it so poorly, in part because of this reluctance to change. Eventually, we have this sort of house of cards. You might say, well, here we are doing the tertiary quaternary stuff. But if all the primary care is gone to some other place because they're doing it better and more efficient than we are, we're not getting our liver transplants. So we'll see. We'll see whether there's enough of an existential threat that the change management piece increases. And technology is also an enabler of change management in some ways because it can build enforcing functions that make you do stuff that you couldn't make people do when they're scribbling. Now, of course, if they push back and threaten to quit and you're desperate to keep them, then you're gonna have to manage through that. But I think it's going to be an interesting 5 or 10 years. I do think we're finally entering an era where there'll be real disruption.
Yeah, thank you. I think the forcing functions that came to my mind just around the time that you said it, but I said to the central staffing office, hey, when people start calling and asking for a person, we don't send a person
Right.
anymore.
No,
We
that's
send
good.
the virtual technology.
Yeah,
So
there's
you
gotta-
have that or you have
exactly.
nothing.
That's wacky. It's got to be, if we know the technology works as well and it's half the price or we've already paid for it, it can't be that a human being now has, relatively low in the organization, has the ability to choose to use it or not to use it. But, you like people to love you and I like people to love me and it's hard to do, but, ultimately we can't do that and have enough money to do all the other things we need to do.
I believe we have another question in the audience here.
My name's Amish. I'm a medical student here at WashU. I really
Great.
appreciate that talk. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
My question is about data set shift. And I think that's especially relevant to medicine because clinical practice guidelines are always changing. And the technical solution to that is to use online learning as opposed to batch learning. But that's kind of opening up a whole new set of problems. The problem is how quickly should that algorithm be learning?
Yeah.
Because if it learns too quickly, it's going to forget what it was trained on initially. And so my question is, where do you think that balance lies?
Yeah, it's a spectacular question. And it's also, if you think about it, you have your algorithm and your algorithm is monitoring the literature. And the literature says the best thing to do is not treatment A, it's treatment B. But is it also monitoring that the quality of the study was a crummy study and it's not good enough evidence for anybody to change practice? It says, or maybe it says, all right, it was in JAMA or something with it, with prestige of above a certain level. So maybe that's good enough. I see this in COVID because we change practice about every 5 minutes. It's based on a preprint that comes out on Twitter. And you say, oh, that's good enough for me to use a different med or swab a different way or use a test in a different way. But that's an incredibly dynamic environment. So there are big fundamental questions there. One of them is it learning from the literature or is it learning from its own experience of the last 10,000 patients we saw like this? And what happens if those are in conflict? What happens if it looks like patients do better on treatment A than B in our experience in the last 10,000 patients, but the literature says treatment B is the preferred treatment? There's a little tension there. You're going to have to reconcile that. This other tension is going to be as the literature changes, how rapidly does the algorithm adjust, and are you going to allow it to adjust without human intervention? But I mean, you could see a chief digital AI librarian whose job it is to, the AI says, I just saw this paper that says the right chemo for this patient with lung cancer no longer is chemo X, but it's immunotherapy, Y. Somebody's, I imagine for a while, some person is going to have to look at that, or some committee, and bless that that actually is practice changing. I don't see in a world where you allow the AI to take the literature and change practice without some vetting of that. But it's a really interesting question. So in this case, the case I showed you, the data set shift was a change in coding. But I think you're right, the real issue is going to be a change in practice. Or, I mean, when COVID started, it was like a change in a disease. There was a brand new disease that it needed to understand. So I think there's always, or at least for the foreseeable future, there's going to have to be a human monitoring all of this and blessing important changes. But it can't be what that study showed, which is you just put the algorithm in and it's static and it doesn't respond at all. Even if the practice, even if there's nothing in the literature that says this practice is changing, there's got to be something baked into your process that says we somehow are monitoring the outcome and the accuracy, and it looks like something's gone down. We don't understand why, but that triggers people in a system to take a good hard look at it. And that clearly didn't happen. And I'm guessing in most systems now it doesn't happen. That's a great point.
Great. Any other questions from the audience here? Yes.
Hi, great talk. My name is Andrew Schutte, currently serve in BJC Strategic Planning. And I'm curious, you mentioned, Google, Amazon, and others, and I think they're famous for sort of working backwards from the end user. And I'm curious from your perspective and reflecting on past as a clinician, how clunky EMRs are. Do you think our pathway could have been different if there would have been more investment in terms of building a system that sort of worked backwards from the end user and the physician, whether the medical record looked more like a chart, et cetera? Do you think there could have been an opportunity for change, or do you believe just that this was the predetermined way it was going to be, regardless of how beautiful the UX or UI would have been?
Yeah, I think I have a lot of sympathy for the Epics and Cerners of the world. These companies made the decision to go into an area that nobody was buying product for a long time. And, I mean, Epic sold to no one until finally in 2003 or 4, Kaiser Permanente decided to buy their system, and that made the company. They simply didn't have the capital to invest in, going into a place like this and looking over your shoulder for hundreds of hours to figure out how you use their UX, and then they rejigger it to make it better. And they come back to be sure that you're happier the next time. And they just happen to be ready when all of a sudden the feds decided to invest $30 billion to bribe us into buying EHRs. So I think there was sort of an inevitability, and it's true in every other industry. The early, IT in financial services and in retail was clunky, and I think there's some piece of this that's just the way it works. The early versions aren't very good. They're certainly not very pretty. The companies have underinvested in user design and user interface. And then they iteratively get better, in part because people complain about it and embarrass them. And the problem is there's not much of a competitive market here. I mean, ideally, you think about the early days of browsers and how quickly, you went from Netscape to whatever to landing finally at Chrome or wherever you are now. The changing costs were zero. I've had many companies come to me and said, all I hear about is how bad Epic and Cerner are. Should we get into that space? And I say, if UCSF is an example, you would have to be 10 times better and 10 times cheaper for us to go through, talk about change management, to go through the brutality of changing over to another EHR. I can't see it. So I'll talk more about this tomorrow, because I think the next era is going to be new tools built on top of the EHR. But yeah, I think it was sort of inevitable that these companies were going to produce products that were decent, good enough to be in the market, good enough for you to want to buy it when you had the means to buy it and you were being forced to buy it. But it was inevitable. It was going to be, I mean, people talk about Epic as the cream of the crop. And, it's sort of, I mean, it's the best thing out there. When we looked, and every other major academic medical center has made the same decision, and it's not terrible, but it's certainly, you can imagine, and you don't have to imagine, because in the rest of your life, what your user interface looks like when you're doing Fidelity or Bank of America or United Airlines or anything. I mean, they're all, decades ahead.
Great. Well, Dr. Williams, if you might close us out for this innovation speaker series.
Oh, this has been a great repeat of every time I've heard you talk.
It's the same talk every time?
No, no, no. It's the same as it's stimulating.
Oh.
Makes me think back of the years in healthcare and how things could have gone differently. And you've always, well, like me in the 1990s, you thought Clinton healthcare was going to succeed probably.
Mhm.
You, however, predicted a lot of things. And I think that prescience is a wonder to behold.
Oh, thank you.
And so for those of you at tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., internal medicine grand rounds, there's Zoom links all over the place too, so you can watch them virtually if you choose to do so. So thanks again for a wonderful
Great.
presentation.
Thanks. Thanks.